Hi guys, today I'm going to talk about Introduction to East Asian Studies. When people hear Asian American today, many of them probably think of success, discipline, hardworking, the small down minority stereotype. But that was not the starting point. Earlier in US history, Asians, especially Chinese immigrants, were often seen very differently as laborers, outsiders, and as people who did not fully belong. So instead of only asking how the stereotype changed, I want to ask who gets to count as a good Asian in the US and who gets excluded from that image. My argument is that US did not simply go from rejecting Asians to accepting them. It kept deciding which Asians were acceptable and under what terms. I think the best place to start is with labor. They were wanted as workers. In the lecture, we see that East Asian laborers were brought in to build railroads and were often used as strike breakers, while white workers in the same jobs were usually paid more. The reading also shows that East Asian workers were pushed into jobs that white workers saw as too dirty or too dangerous. So the key point here is that they were useful but never fully accepted. And once a group is valued mainly for labor, that kind of acceptance is already fragile. It becomes much easier to blame that group when wages fall, jobs become scarce, or social tensions rise. And that raises the next question. If East Asian workers were so useful, why were they later treated as a problem or a threat? I think that is where the larger system starts to come into view. So, what looks like a contradiction is actually part of the system. East Asian workers were welcomed as labor, but not accepted as equals. Employers wanted them because they helped lower wages and weaken worker resistance. The lecture notes show that Asian labor was used to increase labor competition and keep wages down, and white workers, on the other hand, often experienced East Asian laborers as unfair competition, and politicians turned that economic tension into racial story instead of focusing on the employers who benefited from low wages. They blamed Asian workers and described them as a threat to labor and public order and the nation. So the real issue was never simply whether Chinese workers were wanted or unwanted. The deeper issue was who got protected and who could be sacrificed when the system came under pressure. And once that racial story takes hold, the next step is not just resentment, but law. This is where the state steps in. The Chinese Exclusion Act did more than keep people out. The reading describes it as a turning point that helped transform the United States into a gatekeeping nation, where immigration law was used to regulate and control supposedly dangerous foreigners. What matters most to me is that the law did not exclude all Chinese people in the same way. It specifically targeted laborers, while elite groups like students, merchants, and diplomats could still enter. So exclusion was not only about rejection, it was a form of racial sorting. The law created a hierarchy inside Asian migration itself by deciding which Asians were threatening and which Asians were still useful to the nation. But once the state begins sorting people this way, the next question is not only who gets kept out, it is also who gets let in and under what conditions. This is where I think the good Asian is invented. After 1965, Immigration policy shifted and gave more room to Asians with targeted professions and skills. The result was not simply that Asians were finally accepted, it was that one version of Asian America became newly legible as desirable, educated, disciplined, upwardly mobile, and politically quiet. And that is what made the modal minority image so powerful. It looked like praise, but it was really a filtered kind of acceptance. It rewarded the Asians who fit the needs of the nation and made the selective fit look natural. But that praise did not erase the older suspicion. It simply changed terms of acceptance. So the real question becomes if Asians are praised as a model minority, why does suspicion still remain? I think this is where the contradiction finally makes sense. Asians are not simply praised in one era and feared in another. Very often, both happen at the same time. People can see Asian Americans as hardworking, law-abiding, and successful, while also seeing them as overly competitive, not American enough, or culturally distant. So praise is not the opposite of suspicion. It is part of the same structure. It says you can belong, but only in a limited and conditional way. You can be admired, but still not fully trusted. And that to me is why the good nation, Asian, is never completely safe. So, after looking at all of this, I do not think acceptance is the right word, at least not if we mean full belonging. For me, the biggest takeaway is that acceptance and belonging are not the same thing. A group can be useful, praised, or even held up as a success story and still not be fully safe. This is what changed the way I read the model minority myth. I do not see it as evidence that racism faded. I see it as a reminder that inclusion can be selective. It can reward people who fit a certain image while still keeping them on uncertain ground. The COVID pandemic made that painfully clear. One paper points out that anti-China rhetoric and politicization of the pandemic were accompanied by a sharp rise in anti-Asian hate. To me, this shows how quickly the good Asian can be pushed back toward the figure of the foreign threat. So this history is not only about exclusion in the past, it is also about how conditional belonging still works in the present. So, in the end, I think the biggest question is not whether a stereotype sounds good or bad. It's what that stereotype allows people to do. Does it make some groups seem more acceptable and others more suspicious? Does it hide inequality behind the language of success? And does praise actually mean safety or belonging? Those are the three questions I want to leave with the class. Thanks for listening.